It was a quiet afternoon at Martin's supermarket in Fairfax, Virginia, where the usual hum of activity blended seamlessly with the soft shuffle of feet across the polished floors. Samuel entered, his tailored grey blazer standing out among the casual attire of the weekend shoppers. His purposeful stride caught the eye of a few passers-by, but it was the way he carried himself, measured and deliberate, that seemed to ripple through the store. This wasn't just an ordinary trip. Samuel's visit had a purpose, though few could have guessed it. His eyes scanned the aisles methodically, almost as if he were observing more than just the products stacked neatly on the shelves. He nodded briefly to an elderly man clutching a basket of oranges, his quiet acknowledgement slipping by unnoticed. Then he moved toward the produce section, the soft click of his shoes on the floor punctuating the otherwise mundane atmosphere. Behind the register, a young cashier exchanged a whisper with her colleague. "Do you know that guy?" she asked, her eyes subtly tracking Samuel's movements. "He's been walking around like he's up to something." Her coworker, glancing over, simply shrugged. "I've never seen him before. Maybe he's just looking for something." But the whispers didn't stop. As Samuel reached for a Granny Smith apple, a stocky man named Carl, wearing a name tag, stepped forward. His expression remained neutral, but there was a slight stiffness to his posture that betrayed his unease. "Excuse me, sir," Carl said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Do you need help finding anything?" Samuel paused, his calm demeanor still in place as he turned to face Carl, his expression polite but puzzled. "No, thank you. I'm just looking around." Carl hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "It's just that you've been walking around for a while. Are you sure there's nothing you're looking for?" Samuel's brow furrowed, and the shift in his tone was subtle but noticeable. "I'm sure. Is there a problem?" The air between them thickened, the tension palpable even to the other shoppers, who began to notice the exchange. A woman with a full cart stopped mid-step, her eyes darting between Samuel and Carl. Another customer, pretending to read labels on a nearby shelf, leaned in just a little too close, clearly eavesdropping. Samuel, though increasingly agitated, still exuded an air of composure. He reached into his pocket to check a notification, but Carl's eyes followed the motion, his jaw tightening. "Sir," Carl said, his voice sharpening, "I'm going to have to ask you to step over here." He gestured toward the customer service counter, but Samuel did not move. His calm presence stood in stark contrast to Carl's growing insistence. The murmuring hum of the supermarket began to swell with whispers, the suspicion hanging thick in the air. The tension reached a breaking point. Was Samuel a thief? Was there something about him, something about his appearance or his way of moving through the aisles, that set off alarm bells in Carl's mind? Or was it simply the assumption that someone like Samuel, a well-dressed, polished man, could not possibly belong in a place like this without an ulterior motive? This moment was more than just an awkward encounter. It was a reminder of the invisible assumptions that guide our interactions, the subtle biases that shape our perceptions of others, especially when race and class are involved. In that instant, Samuel wasn't just a man in a store. He was the embodiment of a question. How do we navigate a world that judges us not by our actions, but by the way we look? And as Carl's insistence grew louder, the question lingered in the air. Who really belonged here? The man with the blazer, or the ones who felt they had the right to question him? As the situation unfolded, more shoppers began to stop entirely, their curiosity overcoming their errands. Samuel noticed a few more faces turn toward him, their eyes subtly tracking his every move. From the corner of his eye, he saw another employee quietly speaking into a small radio, summoning the store manager. The store had become a stage, and Samuel, unwillingly, was its central figure. "I'm not sure why this is necessary," Samuel said, his tone even and controlled, meeting Carl's gaze head-on. "I told you, I'm just looking around." Carl crossed his arms, his stance rigid. "We have policies, sir. If we notice unusual behavior, we're obligated to investigate." Samuel raised an eyebrow, his patience thinning. "I've picked up one apple. Is that your concern?" The murmurs among the shoppers grew louder, some exchanging whispers, others glancing over with growing suspicion. A teenage boy leaned toward his mother, speaking too loudly. She quickly shushed him. An elderly woman near the bakery section squinted, trying to catch a better view of the commotion. It was clear now, this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was an unfolding drama, one that had captured the attention of the entire store. Now the store manager, a wiry man in his mid-40s named Greg, arrived. His tie was slightly askew, and the tension in his posture made it clear that he had been briefed hastily. He stepped in between Carl and Samuel, his eyes darting between the two. "What seems to be the problem here?" Greg asked, his voice edged with authority. Carl gestured toward Samuel. "This gentleman has been wandering the aisles and acting suspicious. I think we need to check his bags." Samuel blinked in disbelief. "I don't even have bags." Greg hesitated, his gaze sweeping over Samuel, scanning him from head to toe. The tailored blazer, the polished shoes, the expensive watch peeking out from under his sleeve, it all seemed to have a story of its own. For a brief moment, it seemed like Greg might reconsider, but then his tone shifted, still cautious but firmer. "Sir, we'd like to take a closer look, just to clear this up," Greg said, his voice steady but a little too rehearsed. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. He could feel the eyes of the growing crowd on him, the silent judgment pressing in from all sides, louder than any words could have been. The weight of their assumptions was palpable. "I see," Samuel said quietly. "And what exactly are you looking for?" Greg shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward the spectators around them. "We're just doing our due diligence. If you cooperate, this will be over quickly." A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. A middle-aged man in a flannel shirt muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as though disappointed. Samuel sighed, a deep, almost resigned breath. He set the apple back onto the pile with a deliberate motion, then reached into his jacket pocket. This time, he pulled out a slim leather wallet. "Let's save everyone some trouble," Samuel said, flipping it open to reveal a business card. He held it out toward Greg, whose hand hesitated for a moment before taking it. Greg scanned the card, his eyes widening. His face turned pale, the color draining from his cheeks. "Owner." "Greg," whispered, his voice barely audible. His gaze flicked back to Samuel and then to Carl, whose earlier confidence seemed to evaporate before their eyes. Samuel nodded slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, I own this store." Before anyone could respond, the weight of the moment hung in the air, the silence in the supermarket now deafening. Shoppers stood frozen, employees unsure of how to react. Everyone seemed to be processing the revelation in real time, the truth sinking in with a quiet heaviness. Greg stood motionless, the business card trembling slightly in his hand, his mouth opening as though to speak. But no words came out. The silence stretched, an uncomfortable stillness that seemed to encompass the entire store. Carl took a step back, his earlier confidence completely drained. "Wait, you're the owner." His voice was barely a whisper, disbelief threading through his words. Samuel nodded again, his expression calm, unshaken. "Yes, I'm the owner." And in that moment, the assumptions, the judgments, the stereotypes, they all fell away. What was left was a stark realization. It wasn't Samuel's actions that had triggered suspicion. It was the way he looked, the way he was perceived. The irony hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. In a store designed to serve the community, Samuel had been the one to teach a lesson about respect, assumptions, and the invisible lines we draw in our minds about who belongs and who doesn't. The moment had shifted, and now it was up to everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth of their own biases. Samuel stood there, his presence still commanding, even without the blazer. The room was heavy with tension as employees sat in a semicircle, their eyes flicking nervously from him to one another. Some fiddled with their name tags, others stared at the floor, and a few glanced up at Samuel, their discomfort palpable. He waited for the room to quiet, taking it all in. "Thank you all for being here," Samuel began, his voice calm yet firm, still carrying the weight of the previous day's events. "Yesterday was uncomfortable, to say the least, and I think we need to talk about why." The room remained silent. Not even Greg, who usually dominated these kinds of meetings, spoke. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his face ashen. Samuel let the silence stretch for a moment, giving everyone time to feel the weight of what was to come. Then he continued, his words deliberate and measured. "Let me start by saying, this isn't about assigning blame," he said, his eyes scanning the room, making sure he had their full attention. "It's about understanding the choices we make and the assumptions behind them." He paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "Yesterday I walked into my own store," he said slowly, each word striking with purpose. "And I was treated like a suspect." He let the silence stretch a moment longer, watching as heads dropped, some in shame, others in thought. He could see Carl shifting in his seat, his jaw tight. Samuel could feel the tension in the room rise as they understood what he was about to reveal. "Why was that?" Samuel asked, his voice softer now. "Why? Because I didn't look like what you expected an owner to look like." A few heads nodded, the uncomfortable realization settling in. Samuel's gaze rested on Carl for a moment, who, despite his earlier bravado, seemed to shrink in his chair. "I've reviewed the security footage," Samuel continued, his tone hardening again. "I saw how the whispers started, how the stares lingered, and how the situation escalated. At no point did anyone stop to ask themselves if what they were assuming was fair." His voice softened, but the weight of his words did not diminish. He leaned slightly on the edge of the table, his gaze steady as he addressed them all, his words measured but carrying a quiet intensity. "Each of you had a choice," he said. "A choice to make assumptions based on how I looked, how I carried myself, or a choice to approach me with the benefit of the doubt. You didn't choose the latter." Samuel took a breath, allowing them to absorb the gravity of his words. The room was still. He could feel their discomfort, but he didn't soften his gaze. It was important that they understood. "Racism doesn't always look like what we think it does," Samuel continued, the words hanging in the air. "It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's invisible. But it's always present in moments like these." He straightened, his eyes scanning the room once more. "And this is the part where I need you to understand something important. You're all part of this team, my team. I don't want you to just apologize. I want you to learn, to reflect, and to make a conscious choice to change the way you interact with people, especially in moments like these." The room was silent now, save for the sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair. Samuel could see that his words were having an effect. They were listening. "Yesterday," he said, voice rising slightly with conviction, "was a lesson in more than just handling conflict. It was a lesson in what we think about each other and how those thoughts shape our actions." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "Now, I'll give you the opportunity to reflect on this. Because the next time something like this happens, I expect each of you to ask yourself, are these assumptions based on fact, or are they based on bias? And I expect you to act accordingly." With that, he stood tall, his eyes never leaving the room as he made his final point. "We won't be sweeping this under the rug. We will address this head on, and we will be better for it. And I'll be watching." As he walked out of the room, the weight of the conversation lingered. The uncomfortable silence stretched long after he left, a silence that was no longer filled with the tension of the moment, but the slow realization that this was more than just a single incident. It was a reckoning, a lesson that had just begun. Samuel stood before the group, his eyes scanning the room once more, ensuring every employee was engaged. "I understand that not everyone here knows me yet," he began, his tone measured but resolute. "But the way I was treated yesterday wasn't about familiarity, it was about perception, and that's a problem we need to address." He gestured toward a whiteboard, where he had written 2 words in bold letters: implicit bias. "Let's talk about this," Samuel said, his gaze moving over the room. "Bias isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the quick judgment you make when someone doesn't fit into a box you've created in your mind. But those small judgments can have big consequences." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. A young cashier, her eyes wide and hesitant, raised her hand. "Mr. Green, I think a lot of us didn't even realize what we were doing," she said, voice trembling slightly. "It's like it just happened." Samuel nodded slowly, his expression softening. "That's exactly why we're talking about it. Awareness is the first step. You can't change what you don't acknowledge." The room was still, but now, instead of the nervous tension that had been present earlier, there was a quiet reflection. Samuel picked up a marker and wrote another question on the board. "What assumptions do we make without realizing it?" He turned back to the group. "Let's hear from you. What comes to mind?" At first, no one spoke. Then Carl, who had been unusually quiet, cleared his throat. I assumed someone dressed like you wouldn't be the owner," he said, his voice softer than usual. "That's on me. I wasn't thinking." Samuel's gaze lingered on Carl for a moment before he nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for saying that, and it's not just about me, it's about how we treat anyone who walks through those doors. Every customer, every colleague deserves respect." He glanced at Greg, whose face looked more serious than Samuel had seen it all week. After a long pause, Greg spoke up, his voice quieter but filled with sincerity. This was a wake-up call. We need to do better, not just for you but for everyone." Samuel straightened slightly, and a small but genuine smile broke through his serious demeanor. "That's the point. We can do better, and it starts with conversations like this." As the meeting ended and employees filed out, their faces thoughtful and subdued, Samuel could tell that the lesson had only just begun. There was a long road ahead, but this conversation was the first step. Over the next week, Samuel began to implement a series of changes that rippled through the store's operations. He started with the basics, mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and customer interaction. Employees were encouraged to share their experiences, not just in the workplace, but in their daily lives. These sessions weren't meant to be lectures. They were intended to be conversations. Samuel kicked off the first session himself, standing before a diverse group of staff members, his voice steady but passionate. "I want this place to be more than just a supermarket," Samuel said, his eyes meeting those of his team. "It should be a space where everyone feels valued, staff and customers alike." The training included real-life scenarios. One exercise had employees split into small groups to discuss how they would handle specific situations, like a teenager browsing expensive items or an elderly woman lingering near the checkout without purchasing anything. For many of them, these discussions were eye-opening. "I didn't realize how often I make assumptions," Rachel, a part-time cashier in her 20s, admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "It's not something I'm proud of." Her admission was met with quiet, nods from her colleagues, and a few murmurs of understanding. Samuel could see the shift happening. He wasn't just implementing a series of changes, he was helping them rethink how they viewed the world around them. It wasn't just about following new policies, it was about changing the way they saw people, and that was going to take time, but it was a start. Samuel stood before the group of employees, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "I'm glad we're talking about it," he said. Carl, who had been visibly hesitant during the first meeting, surprised everyone by taking an active role this time. "I thought I understood people," Carl admitted, his voice low but sincere. "But these conversations, they've made me realize how much I still have to learn." The changes didn't stop with the staff. Samuel also installed a suggestion box near the entrance, inviting customers to share their experiences anonymously. A sign next to the box read, "Help us improve. Your voice matters." To his surprise, many of the notes praised the staff for their recent warmth and attentiveness, an indication of how quickly the environment had shifted. Samuel knew this was just the beginning. One Saturday afternoon, Samuel held an open meeting for the local community in the store's parking lot. Standing on a small platform, he addressed a crowd of shoppers, employees, and passers-by. "We all have blind spots," Samuel said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the gathering. "The important thing is what we do when we see them. This store isn't just about transactions, it's about people. And every person who walks through those doors deserves kindness, respect, and fairness." The crowd applauded, some nodding in agreement, others visibly moved by his words. After the meeting, as people began to disperse, a middle-aged woman approached him, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for doing this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been coming to this store for years and it feels different now, in a good way." Samuel smiled, his heart swelling with quiet pride. "That's all I wanted, to make a difference." But even as the store began to thrive under its new leadership, Samuel knew that real change wasn't a one-time event. It was a continuous effort, a daily choice to see people for who they truly were. Months later, Martin's supermarket was unrecognizable. Not because of renovations or new products, but because of its atmosphere. The tension and mistrust that once lingered had been replaced by a sense of warmth and inclusivity. Employees greeted every customer with genuine smiles, and shoppers often stopped to chat with staff, creating a community-like feel. One afternoon, Samuel was near the checkout lanes, observing the flow of the store. A young boy ran up to him, tugging at his sleeve. "Are you the owner?" the boy asked, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. Samuel chuckled and knelt down to meet the boy's gaze. "I am. Why do you ask?" "My mom says you're the guy who made this place nicer," the boy said shyly, smiling. Behind him, his mother gave a sheepish wave. Samuel smiled softly. "Well, it wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone here." He gestured toward the bustling employees. "It takes a team to make real change." The boy nodded solemnly, as if grasping an important lesson, and skipped back to his mother. Samuel watched them leave, his heart swelling with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Later that evening, as he locked up the store, he paused to reflect. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had blossomed into something far greater. It wasn't just about fixing a single incident, it was about creating a culture that valued empathy over assumptions, fairness over fear. In his final act of the night, Samuel picked up a marker and wrote on the employee message board in bold letters, "Respect is the foundation of every great team. Let's keep building." As he turned off the lights, he smiled. This wasn't just a job or a store, it was a legacy, and he intended to ensure it was one worth leaving behind. This story reminds us of the power of awareness, humility, and collective effort. We all have biases, But by confronting them with honesty and empathy, we can build spaces where everyone feels valued and respected. If this story resonated with you, consider how you can challenge your own assumptions and foster understanding in your community. Share this video, subscribe for more impactful stories, and let's keep the conversation going.